Let's move on to the Darjeeling Limited, which came out in 2007, co-written by Jason Schwartzman and Roman Coppola. The film is about three estranged brothers, Francis, played by Owen Wilson, Peter, played by Adrian Brody, and Jack, played by Jason Schwartzman, who reunite for a train trip across India. The siblings have not spoken in over a year, ever since their father passed away, and Francis is recovering from a motorcycle accident. Peter cannot cope with his wife's pregnancy, and Jack cannot get over his ex-lover. And the brothers fall into old patterns of behavior as Francis forces them all onto the spiritual journey to try to reconnect, where he finally reveals the real reason for their reunion to visit their mother in the Himalayan convent.
This film was about dealing with grief and loss. These three brothers haven't spoken in a year because they are incapable of dealing with the loss of their father, and it's estranged them from each other. And they all exhibit certain tendencies and behaviors which show how they're trying to avoid the grief and facing the loss of their father. So, for example, Peter, played by Adrian Brody, he wears his father's prescription sunglasses, even though they make his vision blurry because he's trying to keep the world out of focus. He doesn't want to see the world, and he doesn't want to deal with the world, so he keeps his sight and his vision blurry.
Which is in contrast to Richie in Royal Tenenbaums, who uses the sunglasses to hide from the world.
Yeah, exactly. So Jack, Jason Schwartzman's character, he's a writer, but the things he writes are pretty much word for word verbatim situations that have happened, and he's writing a short story about the father's funeral.
And so he's waiting for like the next chapter to unfold.
But I look at it as not that. I mean, that makes sense thinking about it that way too, but he doesn't want to deal with the grief of the loss, and so he's fictionalizing what really happened to make it seem like it didn't happen. You know what I mean? It's like, it's not real because I fictionalized it and I wrote it in this story, so it's not reality. When in fact, so he's just trying to not deal with it himself. And then Francis dealt with the grief by trying to kill himself.
Which we learn eventually later. He disguises it as a motorcycle accident, but
yeah.
Francis's isolation and loneliness post his father's death leads him to that attempted suicide and forces him to come up with the idea to get his brothers together. He plans this grand journey with laminated itineraries, and this kind of seems like a way for him just to kind of save himself, not really just fully to get his brothers to connect. You can see this because he's constantly asking his brothers to come to agreements with him to like formalize every interaction.
So many agreements. Can we agree to that?
Yeah. Can we all agree to this? And it's just his way to, because he needs connection so bad that he literalizes everything.
Since they haven't seen each other for so long, they kind of have lost the ability to properly communicate with each other. They're constantly talking over each other and changing subjects and barely paying attention to each other. And Francis is like ordering food for them and telling them what to get and trying to take control of their decisions for them.
And again, this was co-written by Jason Schwartzman and Roman Coppola, who Wes will go on to write more scripts with. And actually, the three of them, while writing this, they lived in different cities, but whenever they were in the same city, they would have their writing sessions. And then once they had a script, they actually took the trip to India to kind of formulate the rest of the film and get it finished authentically. And they kind of ended up like acting out parts of the movie to kind of get the vibe of the situations. And like how you were talking earlier about how the brothers have kind of lost their means of communicating with each other. They don't really know how to do it anymore. In like the first several scenes with the brothers, when they're together, they're kind of just communicating about themselves and throwing that at their brothers to like talk about themselves. And they're not really looking for opinions back, not too much. And they just want to hear themselves talk. And it's also apparent in that shot inside the train compartments where their three brothers are talking and living in that compartment. And there's a mirror and then there's an open window. And just like how people often communicate is they're just communicating with themselves, even though they're talking to other people, which is basically what the brothers do throughout the film until they start to connect actually.
What's really cool about the train is Wes Anderson actually filmed this movie on an actual train that was moving on an actual train track. And they had to go through several months of negotiations and logistics with the train company, but he was adamant about filming it on an actual train. And this added to the authenticity of feeling the movement of the train and seeing it, and then also the tight quarters of the train and having to film logistically and practically within the small confines of a train.
Yeah, and they had very minimal crew, and the actors were doing basically like their own makeup, and they didn't have trailers or anything, so they weren't like accommodated like actors usually are, because actors are generally coddled like crazy on movie sets.
They have very comfortable lives.
Yeah, they're treated very well, and on this movie they kind of it was just kind of like guerrilla filmmaking in a sense.
Mm-hmm. And Natalie Portman even has a role in this that lasts maybe like 5 seconds, but it's actually tacked on from a short film with Jason Schwartzman's character called Hotel Chevalier. But she actually flew all the way to India and worked for 30 minutes on the movie.
I think she just stayed there too for like a week and a half or something like that too.
And then also, so with Tenenbaum's, Wes began his love of creating unique character designs and wardrobes for his characters. So in this film, not so much, but there is the very unique and distinctive look of Owen Wilson's bandaged face and head, which he doesn't even explain to the brothers until like 15 minutes into the movie when they're like, what happened to your face? So that is an iconic look for the movie of Owen Wilson's wrapped up face.
And of course, filming in India, and they go to a lot of beautiful locations. And Wes he instead of using like these amazing epic shots of like India, he uses India as like a backdrop to the brothers' lives and like their story, because they're still pretty much center frame in all the shots, and it's their discourse that carries every scene. And he just has these beautiful backdrops and these beautiful buildings and sets and everything of India.
Yeah, and I think this movie is just a really, really beautiful story about not just grief but death itself, and that's illustrated in the sequence where they come across the 3 Indian boys who are drowning in that river, and each of the brothers goes to save one of the boys, and then Peter is the last one out of the river, and he says that he didn't save the kid drowned. And then they bring the kids back to the Indian village, and they have that really beautiful memorial and funeral of the kid. And so I think this illustrates how people deal with grief, because this funeral procession and this ritual it's beautiful, and it's kind of like a celebration of the life of the kid. And even though a horrible thing happened, the villagers are very kind to the brothers, and which contrasts with how they have been dealing with the grief of their father, where they've just shut each other out of their lives and have gone down these downward paths in their lives. And so I think the death of this boy and experiencing the different cultures dealing of grief and loss really helped them all grow as characters in order to take a step to begin to overcome the death of their father.
Yeah, and the spiritual process that the Indian villagers go through with the death in their community and with the death of the boy is a very elaborate and, like you said, beautiful process, and it's very respectful, and everyone's kind of grieving together, including the brothers start to grieve as well because they're part of this moment, and it's a way for them to grieve the loss of their father. And what the Indian villagers end up doing is they end up burning the boy's body, and then they all bathe in the river to get the boys' ashes off of their bodies and their clothing. And this is symbolic, where they're letting go of their grief to move on, to not let their past and their sadnesses haunt them for the rest of their lives, which is what's happening to the brothers. And the brothers eventually do the same process later on, because they've been carrying their father's luggage throughout the whole movie, all these suitcases and bags, and even Peter's been wearing his father's sunglasses. Those are prescription sunglasses. Belt. Yeah, and he's been in the what?
The belt.
In the belt. And he's even taking headache medication because he's getting headaches from the sunglasses, which are a prescription, and he doesn't need a prescription. And at the final shot of the film, when that super slow-mo shot of them running to the other train, and they're finally happy, and they finally move past their grief, and they throw the suitcases away, just like the Indian villagers wash the ashes off their bodies.
Exactly. And so the funeral of the boy is the first step, and then the second step was being able to accept their mother's rejection. So we learn they eventually get to their mother, and we learn that she works at a convent, but we also learn that she's abandoned them in their past as children, and they go there to try to find some kind of closure, but it doesn't happen. She abandons them again. So when they were younger, the abandonment from their mother destroyed them emotionally. But now, after being abandoned by their mother again as adults, it's not that hard of a burden on them this time, and they're able to overcome it pretty quickly because they've grown as people and as adults, and they've learned how to deal with grief.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say the protagonists, the brothers in this film, are like typical Wes Anderson characters. Yes, they're kind of like, the classical whimsy and quirky guys in some ways, but they genuinely seem like brothers. This seems like a really intimate film for Wes and the writers, because we just had Royal Tenenbaums before this, where it's a big ensemble cast, and even Life Aquatic. And here it's really just three main characters, and you get to spend a lot of time with them and learn about their character traits and grow with them and go through this journey with them. And they eventually do have that spiritual journey, and they connect and they learn to become brothers again.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is probably Wes Anderson's most personal film, and it's a really beautiful film about tough themes, and we got to see the unique Wes Anderson spin on those themes.
Yeah, and it's like anyone who has siblings or friends and you haven't seen each other for a while and you're somewhat estranged or you haven't talked in a long time and you get together for the first time in a while and you kind of don't know how to communicate and it feels kind of weird. And he does a great job expressing that.
Yeah, that awkwardness. But I recommend this film. This is one of my favorite Wes Anderson movies. It's really beautiful.
I have a poster of it, bro. Everyone's like, what movie is that? I'm like, oh, never mind.